Imagine you're sitting in a laboratory at Yale University in 1961. A man in a gray lab coat hands you a list of word pairs. Your job seems simple enough. Test another person's memory. When they get an answer wrong, you press a button. That button delivers an electric shock. The first wrong answer? 15 volts. Barely noticeable. But with each mistake, you must increase the voltage. 30 volts, 60, 120. The person in the other room starts to grunt in pain. At 150 volts, they're screaming, begging you to stop. The scientist beside you remains calm. Please continue, he says. The experiment requires that you continue. At 300 volts, the person in the other room is pounding on the wall, shouting that they have a heart condition. At 315 volts, there's one final desperate scream. And then, silence. What would you do? Would you stop? Of course you would. Anyone would. Right? Here's the disturbing truth. Most people don't stop. They keep pressing the button. They keep increasing the voltage. All the way to 450 volts. All the way to the switch labeled simply XXXX. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This actually happened. And what it revealed about human nature is more terrifying than any horror movie you've ever seen. Welcome to the story of the Milgram Experiment, the psychological study that proved we're all capable of becoming monsters under the right circumstances. Let's go back to where this all began. It's the late 1950s, and the world is still haunted by a question that refuses to go away. How did the Holocaust happen? Not just the logistics of it, not just the politics or the propaganda, but the human element. How did ordinary German citizens, people with families and jobs and normal lives, participate in or turn a blind eye to the systematic murder of 6 million people? The easy answer, the comfortable answer, was that Germans were different. That there was something uniquely evil about German culture or the German people. That it could never happen here, wherever here might be. But a young psychology professor at Yale University named Stanley Milgram wasn't satisfied with easy answers. Milgram was Jewish. His family had relatives who died in the Holocaust. For him, this wasn't just an academic question. It was personal. Milgram had studied under Solomon Asch, who had already demonstrated that people would go against their own perceptions to conform to a group. But Milgram wanted to dig deeper. He wanted to understand obedience, not just conformity. He wanted to know, would ordinary Americans follow orders to hurt another person, even if those orders violated their own conscience? So he designed an experiment. And what he discovered would change psychology forever. Here's how it worked. Milgram placed an advertisement in a New Haven newspaper. He was looking for male participants for what he called a study of memory and learning. The pay was decent, $4.50, which was about $40 in today's money. When participants arrived at Yale's elegant interaction laboratory, they met two people. One was a stern-looking experimenter in a gray lab coat, a high school biology teacher named John Williams. The other was a friendly, mild-mannered accountant named Mr. Wallace. Both were actors, but the real participant didn't know that. The experimenter explained that the study was testing whether punishment improves learning. Mr. Wallace would be the learner, memorizing word pairs. The participant would be the teacher, administering an electric shock every time the learner made a mistake. To make it seem real, both men drew slips of paper from a hat to determine their roles. The draw was rigged. The real participant always became the teacher. Mr. Wallace always became the learner. Then came the setup that made everything feel authentic. The teacher was given a sample shock of 45 volts. It was real. It hurt. This wasn't a game. The pain was genuine. Next, Mr. Wallace was strapped into a chair in an adjacent room. Electrodes were attached to his wrist. He mentioned casually, almost as an aside, that he had a slight heart condition. The teacher heard this. It would matter later. The teacher was then led to the main room and seated in front of an impressive-looking shock generator. It had 30 switches, ranging from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. The switches were labeled with descriptions: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock. As the voltage increased, the labels became more ominous: intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock. The last two switches, at 435 and 450 volts, were simply marked XXX. The word pairs were simple: blue box, nice day, wild duck. The learner's job was to remember the second word when given the first. But Mr. Wallace, following a predetermined script, started making mistakes. Lots of them. With each wrong answer, the teacher was instructed to read out the voltage level, press the switch, and announce the correct answer before moving on to the next word pair. At first, nothing seemed unusual. 75 volts, 90 volts. Just a little punishment for wrong answers, right? But at 120 volts, something changed. The learner began to shout that the shocks were painful. At 135 volts, he groaned audibly. By 150 volts, he was crying out, "Experimenter, get me out of here. I won't be in the experiment anymore. I refuse to go on." This is where it gets interesting. What would you do in this moment? You're hearing someone in genuine distress. You're causing that distress. The ethical choice seems obvious: stop. But here's what actually happened. When teachers expressed reluctance or wanted to stop, the experimenter used a series of scripted prods. Prod 1. Please continue. Prod 2. The experiment requires that you continue. Prod 3. It is absolutely essential that you continue. Prod 4. You have no other choice. You must go on. If the teacher asked who was responsible if something happened to the learner, the experimenter simply replied, "I'm responsible." And amazingly, that was often enough. The teacher would continue. At 180 volts, the learner shouted that he couldn't stand the pain. At 300 volts, he screamed, refused to provide any more answers, and demanded to be let out. He mentioned his heart condition again, this time with panic in his voice. 315 volts, a desperate, agonized scream. 330 volts, one final scream, and then nothing. Complete silence. No more responses, no more sounds. The teacher, now deeply distressed, would often turn to the experimenter. "He's not answering anymore. Should we check on him? What if something's wrong? What if he's unconscious or worse?" The experimenter's response was chilling in its bureaucratic indifference. If the learner doesn't answer in 5 to 10 seconds, treat it as a wrong answer and continue. Please proceed. Think about what this means. The person has gone silent. They might be unconscious. They might be having a heart attack. They might be dead. And you're being told to keep shocking them. So here's the question Milgram wanted answered. How many people would go all the way? How many would press that final switch, 450 volts, marked with nothing but XXX? Before the experiment, Milgram asked psychiatrists, college students, and middle-class adults to predict the results. The consensus was clear. Maybe 1 or 2% of people would go all the way. Only a pathological fringe, people with sadistic tendencies or serious psychological problems, would deliver the maximum shock. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. 65%. 2/3 of participants went all the way to 450 volts. They continued shocking a man who had gone silent, who might be dead, because someone in a lab coat told them to. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. These weren't sadists. They weren't enjoying it. Many were trembling, sweating, stuttering. Some were laughing nervously, a stress response that had nothing to do with amusement. One man had a seizure-like convulsion. These people were in agony over what they were doing, but they did it anyway. One participant, a divinity school professor, continued to the maximum voltage while shaking his head in disapproval. When asked why he continued, he said, "I was just doing what I was told." Where have we heard that before? After each session, Milgram conducted a thorough debriefing. The learner walked in, perfectly healthy, smiling even. It was all fake. The shocks weren't real, except for that initial 45-volt sample. Mr. Wallace was an actor, and a good one. He had a tape recorder with pre-recorded responses timed to match specific voltage levels. But the participants' behavior? That was real. Their moral struggle? Completely genuine. Now you might be thinking, okay, but this was the 1960s. Maybe people were more obedient back then. Maybe it was a different time, a different culture. Maybe we've evolved since then. Milgram wondered the same thing. So he ran variations of the experiment. 18 different variations, actually, testing different variables to understand what factors increased or decreased obedience. When the experiment was moved from prestigious Yale to a rundown office building in nearby Bridgeport, obedience dropped, but only to 48%. Still, nearly half of people obeyed completely. When the learner was in the same room as the teacher, obedience dropped to 40%. When the teacher had to physically place the learner's hand on a shock plate, 30% still obeyed. But here's the fascinating part. When the experimenter left the room and gave orders by phone, obedience plummeted to 21%. Even more interesting, many participants would pretend to obey while secretly giving lower shocks than ordered. Authority needs to be present and watching. When two experimenters gave contradictory orders, arguing with each other, obedience dropped to 0. Unanimous authority is powerful, but dissent within authority shatters it, and perhaps most telling. When the teacher saw two other teachers, actually Confederates, refuse to continue, only 10% went all the way. Seeing someone else disobey gave participants permission to follow their conscience. The implications are profound. Obedience isn't about evil people or defective personalities. It's about situations. It's about context. It's about the powerful psychological forces that can turn anyone, even good people with strong moral compasses, into instruments of harm. But the Milgram experiment didn't just reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature. It also sparked one of psychology's greatest ethical controversies. Critics argued that Milgram had deceived his participants, caused them severe emotional distress, and potentially traumatized them. Some participants left the lab believing they had seriously hurt or even killed another person. Even after the debriefing, some struggled with what they had discovered about themselves. Milgram defended his work. He pointed out that follow-up surveys showed 84% of participants were glad they'd participated. Only 1% regretted it. Many said it was a valuable, if difficult, learning experience about themselves. But the damage was done. The experiment became Exhibit A in arguments for stricter ethical guidelines in psychological research. Today, no institutional review board would approve the Milgram experiment in its original form. It's too deceptive, too stressful, too psychologically risky. And yet, the question remains, wasn't it worth it? Don't we need to understand these dark aspects of human nature, especially given our history of genocides, war crimes, and atrocities committed by ordinary people following orders? Here's where it gets even more complicated. In recent years, some researchers have challenged Milgram's interpretation of his own data. They've argued that participants didn't simply obey blindly. Many questioned, hesitated, and resisted. The experimenter often had to use all 4 prods, sometimes repeatedly, to keep them going. Maybe, these critics suggest, the real lesson isn't about obedience at all. Maybe it's about something more nuanced. Maybe participants believed, on some level, that the experimenter knew what he was doing, that Yale wouldn't allow anything truly dangerous, that the scientific goals justified temporary discomfort. Maybe they were engaged in what psychologists call followership, trusting that the authority figure had good reasons and moral justification for the procedures. It's not blind obedience, it's misplaced trust. But does that interpretation make it better or worse? In some ways, it's more frightening. It suggests we can rationalize almost anything if we believe it serves a greater good, or if we trust that someone else has thought through the ethical implications. So what does the Milgram experiment actually tell us? What can we learn from this dark mirror held up to human nature? First, the situation matters more than the person. We like to believe that good people do good things, and bad people do bad things. But Milgram showed that's not how it works. Ordinary people, people who would never dream of hurting someone in their daily lives, can be led to commit acts that violate their deepest values. Second, authority is intoxicating. Not just for those who wield it, but for those who submit to it. There's a seductive comfort in being told what to do, in being absolved of personal responsibility. "I was just following orders" isn't just an excuse. It's a reflection of a genuine psychological shift where we surrender our moral agency to someone else. Third, diffusion of responsibility is real. When someone else is nominally in charge, when someone else says they'll take responsibility, it becomes psychologically easier to do things we know are wrong. The experimenter's statement, "I'm responsible," was often the magic phrase that kept people shocking. Fourth, proximity matters. The more distance between us and the consequences of our actions, the easier it is to harm. This explains a lot about modern warfare, bureaucratic evil, and why it's easier to drop bombs from 30,000 feet than to look someone in the eye while pulling a trigger. And fifth, perhaps most importantly, resistance is possible, but requires courage. The participants who refused to continue didn't have special training or unique moral fiber. They simply reached a point where they said no. Some did it calmly, some angrily, but they all found the strength to disobey. The Milgram experiment has been replicated in various forms, in different countries and different eras. A partial replication in 2009, with more stringent ethical safeguards, found similar results. 70% of participants were willing to go beyond 150 volts, the point where the learner first demands to be released. Human nature, it seems, hasn't changed much. So here we are, more than 60 years after Milgram first published his findings. We live in a world where we're still grappling with the same questions. Why do soldiers commit atrocities? Why do employees participate in corporate fraud? Why do citizens support oppressive regimes? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that most of us are capable of doing terrible things under the right circumstances, not because we're evil, but because we're human, because we've evolved to cooperate, to trust authority, to follow social norms. These traits usually serve us well, but they can also be exploited. The real question isn't whether you would have pressed the button. Statistically, you probably would have. 2/3 of people did. The real question is, now that you know this about yourself, now that you understand how obedience works, what will you do with that knowledge? Because awareness is power. Knowing that we're susceptible to authority doesn't make us immune, but it gives us a fighting chance. It allows us to recognize the warning signs, the gradual escalation, the diffusion of responsibility, the language of necessity. We have no choice. It's essential. You must continue. The next time you hear those phrases, in whatever context, remember the Milgram experiment. Remember that ordinary people, good people, can be led to do extraordinary harm simply by following orders. And remember that at any point, you can say no. That simple word, that small act of defiance, might be the most important thing you ever do. Because in the end, the Milgram experiment isn't just about obedience. It's about moral courage. It's about the moment when you decide that your conscience matters more than authority, that another person's humanity matters more than following rules, that doing what's right matters more than doing what you're told. That moment comes for all of us eventually. And when it does, will you be one of the 65%? Or will you be part of the 35% who found the strength to stop? The choice, as it always has been, is yours.